Welcome to Military Analytics. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the province and the Russian army have been increasing groupings within the army. Lack of military personnel and ammunition. Soldiers who do not want to take part in the invasion of Ukraine and drunken Russian soldiers are among the main problems faced by the Russian army. All of these problems cause the Russian army to fail against Ukraine. Although Russian leader Vladimir Putin has taken a series of measures to solve the problems in the army, he has not been successful. For example, Putin deployed Wagner Group soldiers to Bakhmut to solve the military personnel problem in Bakhmut rather than solving the problem. Putin's move only exasperated it because the Wagner Group gained power in Bakhmut and came against the Russian army, so much so that the Wagner Group's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and Putin's friendship ended. One of the measures Putin took to solve the military personnel problem in the Russian army was to release Russian prisoners from prison. The prisoners would be able to regain their freedom on condition that they fought against Ukraine for 6 months. This move, which was made to solve the military personnel problem, caused the problems in the army to increase because the prisoners did not listen to the commanders and could not be efficient in operations because they had no combat experience. Prisoners who fought for 6 months and were released caused problems within the country. It was revealed that 2 prisoners who served in the invasion of Ukraine for 6 months and were released recently committed murder in Russia. Putin creates problems when he wants to solve problems. One of the biggest problems of the Russian army is drunk soldiers. The problem of drunken soldiers has again emerged due to Putin's decision. The Russian army distributes alcohol to its troops in order to warm the soldiers at the front with vodka in cold weather conditions and to prevent soldiers from leaving the front. But Russian soldiers are causing a series of problems in the army due to excessive alcohol consumption, so much so that drunken Russian soldiers are committing irrational acts to the point of killing their own comrades in arms. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has taken a new decision to solve the problems of soldiers who do not want to fight and drunk soldiers in the army. This decision may cause riots within the army because the soldiers are being thrown from the pit to the dungeons one by one. As anchored daily news team, we have compiled for you the actions of drunken soldiers in the Russian army and the developments regarding the new decision. You can click the Super Thanks button below to support our teammates, each of whom continues to work with an understanding of accurate and impartial journalism. Let's examine the developments together. The Russian Ministry of Defense is locking soldiers who consume excessive alcohol and soldiers who do not want to fight in the invasion of Ukraine. In underground pits they have dug. These dungeon cells covered with metal grates are estimated to be only a few feet deep. Images shared on social media show the underground cells with metal grates being dug in a hurry. The Russian military believes that this punishment system will help them correct their troubled soldiers in the early days of the invasion of Ukraine. The Russian army allowed its soldiers who did not want to serve on the front line to return home. However, the Russian army, which has retreated in the face of successive attacks of the Ukrainian army, is now trying to keep its soldiers who do not want to fight due to lack of troops on the front line. So much so that in recent months, images of execution of Russian soldiers caught fleeing the front line have been on the agenda. The dungeon practice of the Russian army, which dates back to the medieval period, came to the agenda with a statement made by the British Ministry of Defense describing these dungeons as improvised cells consisting of holes in the floor covered with a metal grid. The ministry said that the Russian army probably started to punish disciplinary violations and criminal troops by retaining them in dungeons. Drunken Russian soldiers have caused a series of problems in the Russian army since Russia began its occupation of Ukraine. These problems have ranged from Russia's soldiers shooting their comrades to beating their commanders. In the last month of 2022, a Russian soldier drunkenly beat his commander. In this incident, which took place on a military train in the Chelyabinsk region of Russia, the Russian commander died as a result of the blows he received. Another example of the damage caused by Russian soldiers to the army happened recently. A drunken Russian soldier dropped the S-400 air defense system into a ditch in Russia's Tula region. A local channel working on the developments in Russia announced the incident as follows. Yesterday, a soldier lost control and crashed a tractor with an anti-aircraft missile system into a ditch. A 33-year-old drunken Russian soldier crossed a military vehicle with S-400 air defense system into a pole and flipped over the truck, which left the road and overturned into a ditch, did not explode, but the air defense system was rendered unusable. The Russian soldier who was driving the vehicle and whose arm was broken as a result of the rollover was taken to a breathalyzer test and found to be intoxicated. Alcoholic Russian soldiers are engaging in a series of behaviors that will negatively affect the course of the war for them. The problem of alcoholic soldiers in the Russian army is increasing day by day. This fact is clearly visible in the posts shared by Russian soldiers on their local social media accounts. Soldiers are recording and sharing drunken videos. The Russian leaders prefer to punish drunken soldiers rather than expel them from the front line in order not to lose his troops. But it seems that Putin will not be able to solve this problem, as he has failed to solve all other problems. The fact that the Russian soldiers can drink unlimited alcohol as long as they are serving in the occupation of Ukraine has become a hot topic in Russia, so much so that Russian alcoholics join the army just to have unlimited drinking. However, non-alcoholic Russian soldiers also started to consume excessive alcohol, so much so that Russian soldiers do not leave the front line because they cannot consume the alcohol they consume in the army in their civilian life. Russian leader Vladimir Putin turned his soldiers into alcoholics to keep them on the front line, reluctant to fight. It is quite normal for Russian soldiers to drink excessive alcohol and to be at the front without knowing what they are doing, because Russians, who will compulsory conscripted into the army, often cannot find this opportunity even if they wanted to leave the front. The soldiers who cannot leave the front do not want to fight for Putin's political interest, feeling uncomfortable because this reality is on their minds every moment. They are not drunk. Russian soldiers find the solution in drinking alcohol. It seems almost impossible for conscripts to be at the front without drinking alcohol. While the Russian army is struggling with a series of problems, the Ukrainian army is cornering the Russian invaders with successful attacks. In contrast to the Russian army soldiers who do not want to fight and are alcoholics, the Ukrainian army has soldiers who fight for the independence of their land with firm belief in victory. This difference alone shows the strength of the armies and their proximity to victory. Because the strength of an army is not measured by the number of soldiers it has, but by the number of soldiers who believe in victory. The Russian army, which is being depleted day by day, may wave the white flag during the upcoming counterattack by the Ukrainian army. Reluctant soldiers and drunken soldiers in the Russian army can also trigger this development. The war between Ukraine and Russia is preparing for a major spring and summer offensive. Although the war is brutal and tragic, Ukrainians are fighting with all their might to save their land. Ukraine, where the destruction and pain is so intense, is desperately trying to clear its country from the Russians and end the war as soon as possible. These efforts can also be clearly seen on the front lines in eastern and southern Ukraine, where the clashes are most intense. Russian forces look like a toy with a dead battery. This is due to the ineffectiveness of the Russian attacks and their inability to make any progress, as they could not pass the steel curtain of the Ukrainian defense. For this reason, both Western and Ukrainian authorities are constantly working for Ukraine's struggle for freedom, while the Russian army is targeting eastern Ukraine in the spring period. The Ukrainian army is defending the east, and it is seen that there is a major offensive centered on the Crimea. It is clear that for this purpose, the Ukrainian army needs much more powerful tanks than it has now. While a possible Crimean attack is inevitable, the West is sending its strongest tanks to Ukraine in this direction. In this context, Poland sent some of its committed Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky aims to clear all Russians from Ukrainian territory in the spring. In this context, Zelensky reiterates his calls for Western countries to send more weapons and ammunition to Ukraine so that the Ukrainian forces are ready for the spring period. While the Russian forces are suffering from weapons and inventory shortages, Western countries are expressing at every opportunity that the Ukrainian forces are likely to achieve this goal. The Western world, which has not left Ukraine alone since the beginning of the war, started to keep its promises one by one. The country that pioneered the fulfillment of these promises was Poland, which shares the same geography with Ukraine. Ukrainian military personnel completed their training on Leopard 2 tanks in Poland. 40 units of Leopard 2 tanks, which Warsaw plans to send to Kiev, have already been dispatched for use in Ukraine. And in the battle for Bakhmut, Poland did everything possible to create a full Leopard 2A4 tank battalion within the Ukrainian army. In this way, they supported Ukraine within the international coalition. in addition to the 14 Polish Leopard 2 tanks. This battalion also includes 8 tanks, each from Canada and Norway, and also 6 tanks from Spain. After meeting with the Spanish Defense Minister Margarita Robles, it was reported that Spain will transfer 4 more Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Poland has so far sent about 250 Tesla 72 tanks to Ukraine, in addition to 14 Leopard 2 tanks. Warsaw plans to hand over 60 more modernized T-72 and PT-91 tanks to Ukraine. Of course, Poland's support of the Ukrainian war effort is not limited to this. Poland will deliver 60 PT-91 tanks from its own army to Ukraine in the coming days. The head of the Polish government had a joint press conference with President Vladimir Zelensky, touched on this topic of how quickly and how Warsaw can provide the armed forces of Ukraine with more tanks. Poland will deliver the PT-91 tanks, which are in a very good condition, to Ukraine in the coming days. So 60 more tanks will come to Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is undergoing intensive training in Poland. Polish instructors were impressed by how quickly Ukrainian soldiers learned to use modern tanks. Well, what kind of tank is the PT-91? The PT-91 is the main battle tank of the Polish army. The tanks were made on the basis of a licensed version of the Soviet T-72 MBD. The first prototypes were produced in 1993. The basic version was mass-produced in Bumar-Labdi until 2002. During the modernization, the machine retained its basic armament, consisting of one 25mm to a 46mm tank gun and a pair of PKD machine guns. Armor protection also remained unchanged. The main purpose of the PT-91 modernization was to increase the firepower of the tank. To do this, Polish designers installed on the tanks a modern Polish-made SK-1M Drava fire control system and a sniper thermal sight. In addition, tanks were supplied with modern digital radio stations in order to increase the efficiency of the use of tanks as part of the units. The protection of the tank and crew is also reinforced with Polish-made Derari active armor. It belongs to the first generation and can withstand basic cluster munitions such as Soviet-era 125mm squared cluster. The munitions, rocket-propelled grenades, and old ATGMs. In addition, the tank's protection has been reinforced with the Obra 4 laser warning system, which alerts the crew to target laser rangefinder and weapon guidance systems with a laser beam. In addition, the PT-91 is equipped with the new Polish-made 850 HP PZL Volet Wellview diesel engine, which replaces the old Soviet-era 780 horsepower V46-4 engine. Leopard 2 Challenger 2 and Abrams Ponts and P-91 tanks will strengthen the power of the Ukrainian mechanized troops. Poland, Ukraine's most staunch supporter, has changed its place in both Europe and in the world, and it seems that the heart of Europe is now Warsaw. As U.S. President Joe Biden has recently completed his second visit to the Polish capital. Although he has not yet visited Britain or Paris yet, the continued nationalist liberal policies of the Polish government also continue to undermine Europe's unity. The most painful and counterproductive aspect of Polish policy is its hostility to Germany. And if Europe is to succeed in defeating Russian aggression, Warsaw and Berlin must learn to work together. Prior to the Russian invasion, U.S.-Polish relations had hit rock bottom. As a presidential candidate, Biden portrayed Poland as a country where democracy is under threat. Along with Belarus and Poland, along with Hungary, was Europe's troubled child. But today it is a star student. So how did Poland's star shine so bright? Poland led lobbying efforts to impose harsh sanctions against Russia and support Ukraine with strong political, economic, and military assistance. It donated major military aid to Ukraine, including the main channel of military supply and 300 tanks from its own stockpiles. Polish leaders were among the first to arrive in Kiev. Artillery still bombarded the city, and Poland is the only country that has given great support for Ukraine's early accession to the European Union. Unlike others, Poland can also claim moral leadership. Unlike Germany and other Western countries, it has long warned of the dangers of Russian President Vladimir Putin's imperialist policies. He built a pipeline to Norway to replace Russian gas and began to strengthen his army before the war began. Warsaw is now preparing to increase its defense budget to 4% of its overall budget, double the NATO standard, and increase the size of its army from 114,000 to 300,000 soldiers. In fact, in the words of U.S. Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, Poland has now become a humanitarian superpower. Contrary to its outright refusal to accept refugees in 2015 and through Belarus in 2021, the country has provided shelter to more than 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees. A shining example of compassion and empathy. But there is another side to the story. Poland has always put national sovereignty before European solidarity, despite the understandable historical reasons behind this. It is an attitude that prevents the establishment of a strong EU that would be needed to guarantee the continent's security and prosperity. Critically, Poland's current government has attacked a pillar of the EU, namely the rule of law, undermining the independence of judges and undermining the impartiality of the courts. The country's legal polexit rejects the rule of European law, and this dangerous Poland First policy will continue if the current government is re-elected this year. Another danger is the country's deteriorating relations with Germany. Criticism of Germany remains the hallmark of the ruling Law and Justice Party, with leader Jarosław Kaczyński accusing Berlin of trying to create a fourth Reich through Brussels in 2021. The Polish government even released a series of campaign posters depicting German representatives against the backdrop of swastikas and Nazi murders. It would be difficult to find a similar hateful attack by one EU member against another in the entire history of the bloc. Later, when Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced that Germany would increase its defense budget by 100 billion euros, which was welcomed across NATO, Kaczynski asked, perhaps rhetorically, whether the spending was directed at Russia or Poland. Since the invasion of Russia, the Law and Justice Party government has also strengthened its campaign to demand 1.3 trillion euro in World War II reparations. The constant anti-German drumming negatively affected Polish public opinion, and I trillion each to point where Polish politicians no longer avoided being seen in public with the Germans. This election year, Poland prefers to portray Germany as an enemy rather than an ally. In short, German-Polish relations are now as critical for Europe as the German-French relations after 1945. But together, these two countries must develop strategies for rebuilding Ukraine and strengthening NATO's eastern flank. Because the Ukrainian war is a war against which the Western Bloc must unite in order not to separate. After sending a huge shock through the Russian supply lines, Ukrainians shifted their focus from the rear back to the front in order to make the crisis reach the Russians on the zero line. Russians tried to respond by building even more fortifications, but as they started digging trenches on the former burial ground, their troops contracted a fatal disease which took the whole detachment out of the front. Last time I told you that Ukrainians started undermining Russian defense by devoting most of their efforts to disrupting Russian logistics. I also told you that Russians lost 10 oil reservoirs in Sevastopol, 3 oil tankers in Nizhny Novgorod, and a lot of troops and equipment due to precision strikes. The freshest report suggests that both sides decided to cripple each other before the main battle. In order to reciprocate the damage, Russian forces conducted a massive missile strike. The spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force reported that Russians developed a new tactic to break through Ukrainian air defense. Previously, Russians would launch several waves of drones before the missiles and program the missiles for multiple trajectory changes in order to confuse air defense operators. But as Ukrainians get more skilled and room for unexpected maneuvers was reduced to zero, Russians were forced to come up with something new, as caliber rockets are more precise than Ha-101. Russians would use the latter to unload Ukrainian air defense and clear the way for several caliber rockets. In the aftermath of such a strike, Russian forces managed to destroy what looks like a huge ammunition depot in Pavlograd. Pavlograd is one of the main logistical hubs in eastern Ukraine, and the air above this town is well protected. But the new tactic allowed Russians to trick Ukrainian air defense operators and misallocate their targets, which resulted in a weak spot in the sky and allowed at least one rocket to slip through. In the meantime, after striking the main Russian logistical hubs and inflicting indirect damage to the Russian defense line, it was high time Ukrainians shifted their focus closer to the front to inflict direct damage to the defense line. The main targets of Ukrainian artillery once again became positions around Nestorenko because, as you remember, over the last week, Ukrainians have made significant advances around this village and started undermining its defense. The first target of the Ukrainian 44th Artillery Brigade became a tank that was assigned to reinforce a strong point along the tree line. This was not the only position reinforced with tanks. In fact, it is a prevalent practice to fortify open areas with tanks. It has its advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, in a ground assault, it is virtually impossible to breach a strongpoint in the field that is under the protection of a dug-in tank. On the other hand, it is an easy target for the artillery. Ukrainian drone operators also unveiled hidden trucks in the tree lines, together with an armored personnel carrier which were likely used to deliver ammunition, as seen from the footage filmed by Ukrainian fighter. They are constantly battling with the enemy mortar crews, so it did not take long to reveal the positions of the mortar crews and their refilled ammunition depot. As a result of the coordinated actions on the part of drone operators and artillery crews, Ukrainians destroyed 3 tanks, 4 trucks, 1 armored personnel carrier, and 2 ammunition depots around Nestorenko. This is quite a significant hit for such a small section of the front line and might indicate that Ukrainians will soon attempt to widen their bridgehead further. That is why Russians continue digging new trenches in order to boost their defense. Unfortunately for Russians, they start digging trenches and making a new defense line on the territory of the former burial ground for infected cattle. Ukrainian head of Melitopol reported that while building new strongpoints, Russian forces contracted anthrax, which can be a fatal disease that requires immediate treatment. Because Russians realized it too late, people that were showing clear symptoms were sent to Russia while the whole detachment was put on quarantine. The equipment was left untouched, and the dedicated defense area became an exclusion area. If the detachment communicated with other people, for example, those who deliver supplies, or with their commanders, then the implications can be far-reaching, and it is not necessary for the disease to spread to cause trouble. It is the preventative measures that can undermine Russian capabilities the most, as communication may be restricted, which may mean fewer supplies, and more importantly, worse control over the readiness of the Russian army to meet the Ukrainian offensive.